The AAA video game is like a time capsule. It's usually an indication of popular trends on release, as well as just big publishers trying to make money. The concept is simple. You have a video game, you put a lot of freaking money into it, slap on the label AAA, and call it a day. It's also, in 2022, a dying form of the medium that's been totally overtaken by smaller budgets, indies, a dime a dozen free-to-play titles, and the seemingly infinite amount of games as a service releases. It's hard to really tell when the term AAA came into prominence, as it just kind of became a thing over time. Suddenly, these big budget games would have big commercials and marketing campaigns. This arbitrary classification seemed to really come into play largely during the 7th generation, but you can see examples as early as the 90s. I mean, having been around back then, the first time I saw Final Fantasy VII, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, or Metal Gear Solid, I was blown away. I and many others were used to playing some kiddie scrimblow thing like Donkey Kong Country 2 or Sonic 3D Blast, and now we're given 3D cinematography, big open worlds to explore, voice acting, and at the time, incredible CG cutscenes. The leap was noticeable, and let's just say Gex 3 wasn't getting itself a multi-million-dollar marketing campaign. Though, maybe it should have. The fun part was when, sometime in the late PlayStation 2 era, that everyone and their mom decided they were gonna make AAA. That was the future, that's where the money's gonna be. Big, huge, full-priced video games made on a gargantuan budget that sell 10 million copies. Cause apparently, if you only sell 3 million, it's a disappointment, and Square Enix will sell you off to fund something stupid. There's a lot of these, and that's what we're gonna be talking about.
So yo, it's Austin, and today we're looking at AAA games from yesterday. This is actually gonna be a pilot for a concept that I've been wanting to do for a while, where you talk about games in a deep dive style, but not necessarily 100%. So if you wanna see more of that, let me know down in the comments. After all, someone's gotta go deep into Fuse. Anyone remember that? I want to go through the recent history of AAA titles while spotlighting some relevant and interesting things, like stuff that hasn't been ported or remade. Like obviously we're not going to be talking about The Last of Us, it's been ported and remade. Give them like 3 years, we'll probably see a remake of the second one too. So buckle up, put on that pair of cargo shorts you still own from when you bought Halo 3, and if you're feeling a bit peckish, maybe grab something with today's sponsor, Factor. Halloween is over, and we're into the festive holiday season, and as I'm sure you can tell by how many videos I've been putting out, I don't really have much time to grab anything healthy or cook. Luckily, I still got Factor, and its fresh, never frozen meals on the go are a good way to keep my diet in check. One with a lot of choices too. There's now over 34 meals each week to be delivered to your door, with a bunch of add-ons to keep your fridge stocked with stuff that, frankly, owns. Eating out is expensive, and Factor's cheaper than that, and its no prep, no mess meals include diet selections from like keto, vegan, vegetarian, low calorie, and protein plus. Slap that in the oven or microwave and you'll be eating good in minutes. I'll gladly eat anything out of that box, but this week I was a really big fan of the chicken, bacon, and garden pea cavatappi. You telling me that I can get some good low calorie pasta delivered? Yeah, they're flexible with options, it's tasty and healthy, and if you need some add-ons like juices or some of their plant-based smoothies that are really good on the go, I highly recommend these. Factor does own HelloFresh, and we've done sponsors with both, so you can use one of my codes and get a nice meal on me. So this holiday season, if you're wanting to eat healthier or just support a busier lifestyle, head to go.factor75.com/eruption60 and use the code eruption60 to get 60% off your first Factor box. Go show them some love, it really helps the channel. Thanks to Factor for the sponsor, but for now, we need to talk about some AAA video games, and for that, we might as well go back to the very beginning of time, the 90s.
If you think of the PlayStation 1, Nintendo 64, or Dreamcast, you probably don't think of AAA. But this was around the time that the bigger budgets started to really pop off, like you'd see with games like the previously mentioned Final Fantasy VII, 8, or 9. A lot of the first-party Sony-published titles in the PlayStation 1 were also clearly a step above what a lot of the third parties were doing. Any look at Wipeout or Twisted Metal as opposed to, say, Bubsy 3D, and you knew this felt bigger. Driver 1 and 2 also looked more expensive at the time. Heck, this thing in the crappy Batman and Robin PlayStation 1 games felt like precursors to Grand Theft Auto 3. However, the first example of a real AAA game, like it or hate it, in my opinion, would be the original Shenmue for the Dreamcast. Which makes sense considering it and the sequel cost Sega reportedly $40 to $70 million after marketing.
How about trying Lucky Hit? How about a game of Lucky Hit?
Even in the States, the promotion for this thing was everywhere, and it grabbed everyone's attention. You had this fully voice-acted, seemingly open-world adventure that was leaps and bounds beyond everything at the time. If you just look at a list of games made in 1999, it definitely appears to be from a totally different generation. Sure, maybe it's not better than, say, Legend of Dragoon or Ape Escape or whatever else, but it does look expensive. Shenmue's kind of an obvious example, but for me, it was one of the first games that grabbed my family's attention. Prior to this, I would sit around by myself slapping a controller while beeps and boops flew out of the TV, but even my mom got invested into Ryo Hazuki's quest to find his father's killer. And sailors.
Do you know any sailors?
Sailors? How about a cola?
Sure.
Voice acting, good or bad, does a lot.
If you ever run into trouble, come talk to me.
It's when we move into the 6th generation that things become notably bigger. While the initial leap from PlayStation 1 to 2 didn't seem as big as, say, the Super Nintendo, the Nintendo 64, with time we would begin to see things in a newer, more expensive light. And a lot of that was seen with first-person shooters.
FPS at this time were nothing new. I mean, we had Doom back in 1993, but when they started to hit the console market and sell a more ridiculous amount, we'd start to see these games look more and more expensive. Obvious examples are like Medal of Honor, the first Call of Duty, Halo 1 and 2, but the first time I played Red Faction and blew a hole into the wall, my mind was blown. But you know what took that concept to another dimension? Criterion Games Black. Developed by the folks who made Burnout, Black said, what if you could blow up everything? And do that, they did. However, I think it got severely buried by the fact that it released all the way in 2006, several months after the Xbox 360 hit stores, meaning their big, expensive AAA-ness was already surpassed by something like Call of Duty 2. Black is no joke though, it's just a bit of a one-trick pony. The story is a standard military affair and the levels are mostly warehouses and various buildings, but when you remember the platforms this was on and the things they were trying to do with destruction, it becomes way more impressive. I'm surprised EA didn't try to make this a cross-gen title like Activision's Gun, which is a whole big AAA thing I want to talk about at some point. It wasn't just the first-person shooters that did this though. First-party Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft games began to look and be more high-budget over time with releases like The Getaway, Dark Cloud 2, and the God of War series becoming visual showcases. But the genre that really took it to the next level were RPGs. One look at Final Fantasy X or 12 and you knew this was a big deal. The same deal with Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, an RPG so huge it launched the developer, BioWare, into a new realm of expectations and storytelling, player choice, and just looking big and expensive. They also did Baldur's Gate and Neverwinter Nights, which were great, but I mean, who at the time wasn't into a choose-your-own-adventure, become a Jedi type of thing? One where we'd all become friends with the droid who'd call you a meatbag, HK-47.
Negative. I just don't like organic meat bags. Except for the master, of course.
I think we're all missing good old BioWare, what with their past 10 years of releases being mid to Y, but it's crazy to me that they followed KOTOR up with Jade Empire. Originally published by Microsoft, which I think a lot of people forget, Jade Empire was BioWare's first attempt at creating their own IP. Similar to Dragon Age and Mass Effect, Jade Empire spent several years in development in order to shape and craft this world, the lore, all of the small details. In fact, this one was a dream project for BioWare's co-founders at the time. Jade Empire feels like an action version of KOTOR, even using the same morality system. But instead of being in an old galaxy far, far away, it's in, well, the Jade Empire, a fictional region based off of Chinese history and mythology. You pick an avatar from a set of different characters, each with a different combat style to embark on a journey with. Their entire personality is based off of whatever you pick. The plot, totally distilled down, is defeat the Empire, or side with them. With Jade, you'd be making choices and having the story play out in a way that you'd like to see it. It's not quite as branching as, say, Alpha Protocol, but it has that BioWare signature. At least you know you're choosing the evil option when you're gonna say something and your character makes this face. The combat is really interesting. It feels like an action RPG, but uses stance switching with fighting styles you unlock as you go through. These fighting styles include weapons, shooting fireballs, or just ways to regain chi. It's a very flippy game that has you actively dodging a lot, very different from anything they've developed prior, which also means it's quite a bit harder. Nowadays, Jade Empire is a bit dated, especially in the script and voice acting, but I always thought that this was a killer AAA that went in one ear and promptly out the other. It doesn't help that it came out in 2005 as an original Xbox exclusive and didn't hit any other platforms until 2007, and that was just PC. Seems like BioWare's even forgotten about it. It doesn't have a store page, and if you go to their actual games list on their website, nothing prior to Mass Effect even exists, which is bizarre. If you ask me, they're just trying to hide Sonic Chronicles. There's plenty of examples of neat early AAAs from the PlayStation 2 era that I'll get around to one day, but it's the next generation where things get wacky.
And I do mean wacky. As more and more AAA video games came out, the expectations and wants of the consumers began to also go up, meaning that it was time to hunker down and spend some money. Those quick and super fun Dreamcast arcadey titles weren't going to cut it anymore, which is a shame because I would play Zombie Revenge over like half of these any day. But yeah, the gates were wide open.
Something happened in the mid-2000s to gaming culture, and it's one word: hype. The hype machine became this ridiculously integral part of marketing, so each and any publisher would start spending a metric frick ton of dosh on advertisements, collaborations, celebrity cameos, you name it.
Give me what I want!
The second Kaz Hirai exclaimed his excitement for playing Ridge Racer on the PSP to an unamused crowd of investors and journalists, you knew things were gonna change.
Ridge Racer!
E3 press conferences became more and more accessible to see, and it turned from this boring thing you'd watch to learn about the cell processor into
world premiere.
Well, bam! There it is.
You'll be sucked.
And so began the era of publishers announcing their big fancy AAAs on the grandest stage of them all, WrestleMania, Sony, Microsoft press conferences, or just doing it themselves.
Peggle 2!
This is how the entire world was introduced to Assassin's Creed. It's hard to believe that the original AC came out over 15 years ago, and even harder to believe that this became such a huge franchise. Ubisoft's Assassin's Creed was, in my opinion, a super underwhelming time. It's also one that gave me a lifelong vendetta against pre-ordering, and a specific GameStop employee who convinced me to pick this over Mass Effect. Live and learn. Altair's story was one that was fascinating, but not nearly as interesting as the whole meta-narrative with a character named Desmond going into a simulation of historical events. This has been largely dropped in favor of the stories they're telling nowadays, but Assassin's Creed is pretty well known despite its ups and downs. A lot of downs, but it's still relevant. They peaked it too, I'm just gonna say it. Though we'll come back to Unity one day, because someone's gotta. The 7th generation was filled with an absurd amount of AAAs of varying quality, all by just about every publisher. You had major ex-Square-Enix developers forming Mistwalker and putting out both Lost Odyssey and Blue Dragon, two rare JRPGs in an era where they were fading away. Both with ridiculous production values, and one, basically, my true Final Fantasy XIII. Ubisoft, of course, fell into the open world formula around this time with Far Cry 3, but its predecessor, Far Cry 2, was this ridiculously punishing survival game that is only enjoyed by the largest of hipsters and masochists, like me. The idea of a mainstream AAA title making you deal with random malaria attacks is unheard of. Oh, and don't forget about Lair, the PlayStation 3 exclusive that was the death of Factor 5, one of my favorite studios from the time. This thing had so much potential but was doomed thanks to that trusty 6-axis controller, even though they patched it too late. It's not all Western developers though. Around this time, Japanese studios decided they were shifting the way they were developing games to try and appeal to Western audiences, and that was mostly to mixed results. Anyone remember Never Dead? I wouldn't be surprised if you don't. Though if we're talking Japanese AAA, I gotta bring up Mind Jack. Okay, not really. Binary Domain. I have a ridiculous soft spot for Binary Domain, and it's hard not to when you realize it was created by Ryuga Gotoku Studio, the people behind the Yakuza franchise. Unfortunately, AAA or not, when you only manage to sell 20,000 copies, that's
not good. No, don't do it.
You could tell this was Sega going deep into the iRobot thing that was popular at the time. You play as big generic white man Dan, who teams up with an international group of soldiers attempting to infiltrate Japan and take down the evil robotics corporation. Along the way, you meet several extremely likable characters, all nearly Street Fighter level stereotypes. Yeah, like Jade Empire, it's a tad dated in some aspects, but there's not another game in existence that's got a cool French robot named Kane.
Oh, ice front! Ice front!
Chance of collision was only 62%.
It's also surprisingly really funny. You can tell it was written by the Yakuza team, as there's a lot of wacky character moments and interactions that have the potential to vary depending on who you pick for your fire team. That and the way you interact with them can have different endings and consequences, by the way. It's surprisingly deep. The game itself, it's Gears of War with robots. Cool robots that actually break apart when you shoot them too. I was really impressed with how much effort was put into the destruction here. The bosses feel huge, and when you're blasting off bits of armor, it feels awesome. The main shtick of Binary Domain was the voice recognition system that you'd use to communicate with your team. When I originally played this, I guess just used the right exact headset to make it work, because I was able to play it while dishing out commands to my team no problem. You can even talk smack, flirt with, or say really stupid stuff that the characters react to, which will then influence if they like you or not, so don't mess up. My current microphone doesn't quite work with it, so unfortunately I have to use the base commands, which does take away a lot of the charm, but I think Binary Domain is still a pretty enjoyable time. One with probably the best ending you could ever imagine that sets up a sequel we'll never see. This one deserves better.
The 7th gen was also home to something that would bomb so hard it would go into hibernation for like another 6 years, AAA licensed titles. I can see the thought process. You got yourself a big fancy popular IP, you got a bunch of money, and you put them together and try to make something in a year, which isn't gonna work. I don't think anyone really did this well, but they tried.
Oh boy. Licensed games quality were really a flip of the coin back then. You can end up with something totally awesome like X-Men Origins Wolverine or Batman Arkham Asylum one day, and then 007 Legends. Not only the last Eurocom title, but also still the most recent James Bond tie-in since Activision lost the rights. They quite literally threw a bunch of Bond-themed levels into a Call of Duty shoot-bang engine, rushed it out for the holidays, and removed it from digital stores not even 3 months later. Was this a tax write-off? I'm not sure, but they took those middling review scores, turned Bond into a crazed murderer, and sure made nothing worthwhile. Thanks, Activision. It wasn't all bad though. Electronic Arts had the Star Wars license around this time, and they put out Star Wars The Force Unleashed for the everything. I think everyone who was around back then watching trailers remembers the visual of Starkiller throwing around a Star Destroyer, or like the opening mission being you running around as Darth Vader murdering a bunch of Wookiees. These days he's busy thanking the bus driver and slapping around Goku, but The Force Unleashed was cool. Starkiller wound up in Soul Calibur too. Can't hit the gritty in that though.
However, there's nothing to me that screams AAA from yesterday more than a totally mid-licensed title that unfortunately destroyed the developer. Keeping it with superheroes, I finally sat down and played X-Men Destiny, and it sure is something.
Silicon Knights, a name that evokes either nostalgia or disappointment. The creators of Blood Omen Legacy of Kain, as well as Eternal Darkness Sanity's Requiem. The people who remade Metal Gear Solid on the GameCube with the twin snakes. And also the group responsible for one of the most notorious 7th gen games, 2 Human. We'll tackle that one day, because X-Men Destiny is a whole thing. You're looking at something made in 2011, and if that doesn't sound right, well, it's perfectly normal, just like when the wireframe slips out. X-Men Destiny is a good concept. It follows one of 3 characters who find themselves involved in a conflict between humans and mutants, each with their own backstory. I played as a kid named Adrian Luca, who's totally not super racist until he develops mutant powers, where he then has to team up to stop the people he once supported. Your typical X-Men anti-hero, but also one that absolutely looks like a hollowed out version of Ricky Starks. The gameplay is your standard 2-button affair, where you're getting bigger combos the more you level up, but it's not even as technically complex as a Dynasty Warriors title, so it gets a little mind-numbing quick. There's a little diversity in your passive abilities as you unlock DNA strands for familiar heroes like Cyclops or Wolverine, and they'll change a few things, but it never gets more complicated than a few seconds of diverse combat. You'll occasionally end up fighting alongside famous mutants like Pyro, who will spend half the time making random quips. He's Australian, right? What do we make him say?
Toss me another shrimp for the barley.
Of course. This thing is just weird. It's only like 4 hours long per character, each of those routes being exactly the same. It has a lot of visual glitches. I mean, Gambit's code's just doing its own thing. Anytime a new character's introduced, it's like, oh, hey, Borderlands? The frame rate drops to abysmal levels on the reg, and also there's a big lawsuit that made them recall and destroy every unsold copy of the game. Just gotta slide that one in. Silicon Knights and Epic Games had legal issues due to the Unreal Engine with 2 Human and X-Men Destiny, so they had to just totally shut this one down. I imagine the game would actually be worth a pretty penny too if it were good. Unfortunately, the budget on this thing was reportedly slashed into a fraction after Disney acquired Marvel, and that's pretty obvious when you play it. I do think that X-Men Destiny got a bit too much crap for what it is, but for what it's worth, it's just another weird, likely now forgotten AAA title from yesterday, totally unplayable and mostly notable for being a studio's swan song. and lawsuits. This, just like Thor, 007 Legends, or any of the many AAA licensed games from the era, are just another notch as to why these went away. In the 8th generation of consoles, the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, licensed games went on the back burner, especially in the AAA category, and it wasn't until maybe Alien Isolation or Insomniac's Spider-Man that these started to make a mainstream comeback. But yeah, another day, another video about me being stupidly hyped for the Wolverine game that I know nothing about. Shoutouts once again to CG Armhair.
Speaking of the PlayStation 4, the 8th generation is when we would start to see the decline of frequent AAA releases, because, you know, like in the 2000s, we were seeing like 3 or 5 of these a week. Heck, when Assassin's Creed 1 came out, it was surrounded by Crysis, Kane and Lynch 1, Uncharted 1, Mass Effect, and that's just a couple. You'll get some overlap here and there, but these days it's way slower.
Doesn't help that everything wants to hold your attention forever. With indies and digital titles becoming more and more accessible, the need for AAA video games becomes less and less. Why spend $1 million producing something when, you know, you got something like Undertale on a small scale Kickstarter budget knocking it out of the park? But they still exist with budgets even larger than before, player expectations through the roof, and longer, more expensive development cycles. I'm sure some of you remember The Order 1886, a third-person cinematic shooter taking place in a fictional Victorian-era London with werewolves and guns. An aesthetic I love to death, but also it's something that can be beaten in like 7 hours with a huge amount of cutscenes, quick time events, and slow RP walking. Not bad by any means, but it definitely got a big backlash for being, well, hardly a video game. That, and it doesn't take up the full screen. I somehow either liked it enough, was bored enough, or was going through a bout of enough depression to platinum it back in 2016, so take that as you will. There's a lot of neat but underperforming AAAs from this era. Square Enix rebooted Thief around this time with an experience that didn't really understand the free-form exploration and stealth gameplay from the past, but that was just Square in this whole era. Big expectations, big budgets, big marketing, most of the time falling short. Even the reboot Tomb Raider franchise, which we learned recently sold around 38 million copies altogether, was considered disappointing.
I can't imagine what they thought of Murdered Soul Suspect.
Murdered Soul Suspect is a game that came out of nowhere, pretty early into the PS4 era, and it was one of the few cross-gens before that faded away. Developed by Airtight Games, the group who worked with Capcom on Dark Void, another bizarre AAA, Murdered is an adventure murder mystery. You play as a dude named Ronan, who is very dead. This dude's walking around like Kenshiro from Fist of the North Star. Soul Suspect is a game that's super neat in theory, but was critically dragged at the time with mixed to awful reviews. It wanted to take a page out of LA Noir's playbook, but didn't quite get those high highs due to a noticeably lower budget. That, and anytime you're shoved into sudden demon-avoiding stealth gameplay, it's noticeably way lower quality. The investigation and story is novel. Since you're a freaking 50 Cent ghost, you have the ability to clip through all kinds of walls as well as possess the living. You can influence their actions and read their minds, but I don't think it goes as far as it should. Weird to say, if this were a tiny bit more like Geist in the GameCube, I think it'd be better. Although you do get to play as a cat, and I love cats, especially when you get a meow button. Square Enix and Eidos didn't have the best of luck, but hey, for some reason it still has more players than Babylon's Fall. The earliest releases from the 8th generation were kind of closer to tech demos than full games. It's around this point in time, however, when publishers started to go a little overboard with monetization. These full-priced, now $60 products you'd buy even digitally would have pre-order bonuses, in-game microtransactions to make them like easier or in some cases necessary. This is also when we would see the full expansion of the season pass, a way for these things to have a life beyond their initial release. It's not something I'm against. I think extra content in a product is a great idea if the fans are there for it. Just maybe don't plan around it. Or in the case of Dead or Alive 5 and 6, double digits amounts of $90 costume packs. This concept is just one of the many mistakes Microsoft made around the time, but just about every launch title on the Xbox One had a ridiculous amount of microtransactions. Crimson Dragon, in-game currency. Every Forza, microtransactions. Halo 5, Warzone, show me the loot crates. It's a miracle that single-player Sunset Overdrive didn't have any of these, but unfortunately, Rise Son of Rome wasn't spared. Rise is one of those games that feels totally out of place, not just as an Xbox One launch title, but but also as something made by Crytek. It's extremely unlike anything they've ever made, and that's probably because it was originally designed specifically with the Kinect in mind. The original Xbox 360 trailers for this showed a dude swinging imaginary swords and doing imaginary headbutts, but the final product ended up being a more traditional hack and slash with voice commands for your troops. Extremely generic in concept, but also a game that still looks really freaking good. That CryEngine holds up. The whole thing is pretty simple. You're a big Roman man fighting and murdering endless amounts of people as you get stronger, and, well, it's pretty forgettable. Rise feels like AAA video game trademark. Launch title, gimmick tie-in, and trying to do just about everything. It feels like the most expensive version of a PlayStation 2 action brawler like Genji or God of War. Not bad, just meh. Weirdly, it also got a multiplayer mode, one that I was actually able to find a match for at like 9 p.m. on a Thursday. This is just a co-op arena hack and slash. I do like the alternate history aesthetic with a bit of futurism tossed into a historical setting, although including the Crisis suit might have been a bit much. He's so thick! How? AAA titles like Rise might have been seen as the picture-perfect big-budget video game for a while there, but in the end, it feels more soulless and lacks the character that makes you stand the test of time. It also dates itself by having the main menu UI look like the Xbox 360 NXE dashboard. Rise also came out on Steam a year later, so if you really want to experience the quintessential investor-safe AAA, be my guest.
We've reached the end, and I've got one more big AAA that I want to talk about. One that totally encapsulates everything with Capcom in the late 2000s, and it's funny because I could be talking about a lot.
Capcom sure wanted to strike gold with the Western audience in the early 2010s. There was Dark Void, as we mentioned earlier, Lost Planet 3's fake Nicolas Cage ice adventures, and even Dead Rising went in a weird direction with 3 and 4. DMC, Remember Me, probably don't. There's plenty to go on, but the most notorious and probably strangest thing they released back then was their big AAA mainstream attempt at rebooting Bionic Commando, a game that was compared to and overshadowed by its own way cheaper Xbox Live Arcade remake. The Game Boy version of Bionic Commando was the first time I played something portable, in the back of a car where I could barely see, of course, but it left an impression. The whole arm-swinging mechanic is something that gave me, and probably countless others, the closest we'd get to a Spider-Man-like experience back in the day. I can't believe that Capcom barely did anything with the series over the years, especially considering how often they'd make sequels and extra versions of everything. But Rad Spencer is a fun character that deserved more. I'll take any game with exploding dictators, though. Old 80s Rad Spencer meet 2009's Nathan Spencer, a strikingly weird character design that ditched the sunglasses in exchange for dreadlocks and a healthy dose of edge. And I kinda love it. Bionic Commando 2009 is one of those things that I think got totally overhated when it came out. I think there was a heavy anti-Capcom sentiment during those years, which, understandable with what they were gonna be doing, rest in peace Mega Man Legends 3, but their westernization efforts were in full swing with this. Developed by Swedish studio Grin, Bionic Commando takes us directly into a war zone as a bionic operative who uses a giant arm to do all kinds of terrorist fighting, be it through punching, slamming, or of course, swinging. This whole experience is camp, and one mostly narrated by Steve Blum and Mike Patton of Faith No More fame. And by narrated, I mean mostly these two dudes talking smack at each other. The story is kinda incomprehensible, with the majority of the world building and exposition being in text lore dumps, but some of the gameplay is a total blast. The swinging? It's good. I didn't think it would be good. I feel like the internet collectively decided this game was bad, but no one actually played it. When it works well and you're grappling between buildings while blasting dudes in midair, it feels great. The guns are easy to aim and fire while you're swinging. The aiming is pretty forgiving, and some of the maneuvers are ridiculous. The pistol never has to be reloaded, by the way. It's got limited ammo, but the largest freaking clip you've ever seen. You get to punch boxes into the air and then kick them at enemies. You've got a stupid amount of ways to knock dudes out, some more memorable than others. The main issue here is that Bionic Commando is short, real short, which for a full-priced product, AAA or not, isn't great. According to a lot of the reviews at the time, this, as well as its uninspired aesthetic and design, were major points against it. That, and it was the reboot of a franchise that Capcom had lying around dormant for, prior to the remake, over a decade. All of this and more was probably a major reason that this thing only sold 27,000 copies in its first month. Ouch. The total lifetime sales that were revealed this year showed that it managed to get 1.3 million across all platforms over, 13 years, but this was a clear sign of the different landscapes with video games at the time. The Japanese studio trying out the Western AAA thing, getting a resoundingly mid-critical reception, totally bombing commercially, and getting a bad rep. Though I'm gonna blame that on the ridiculous amount of ads all over the place. Nvidia, Dark Void, Capcom Unity, woohoo! In 2022, Bionic Commando 2009 is a totally forgotten AAA game from yesterday, and a perfect example of a slowly fading style that we rarely see anymore. If you're someone that dismissed this over the years without playing it, give it a shot. It's far from perfect, but the swinging can give you a few hours of fun. Just try your best not to laugh at how ridiculous Nathan looks. Also, try not to think about the story and how your spoilers, dead wife is your arm. Yep, that's this game.
So there you have it, a weirdly curated list of AAA video games from yesterday. Now, like I said at the beginning, I'm wanting to maybe see if this pilot is something that you guys are interested in and talk about a bunch of these individually. So if you do like it, let me know it on the comments, and if there's any specific games you think I should talk about, let me know as well. There's certain games that I want to do deeper dives into without necessarily going for that 100% and, sorry, I just keep looking at Too Human and it hurts. Go show a little love to today's sponsor, Factor. They're always great, and hey, if you're feeling a little generous and want to help out the channel directly, maybe check out my Patreon. It's thanks to all of y'all watching and the Patreon supporters that help keep this thing going, and I thank y'all 1,000 times over. Speaking of deep dives, I've been Austin, and catch me next time when I go 100% into every version of Sonic Unleashed, because I'm clinically insane. Also, I saw the poll results. You'll get your Gotham Knights.
Thank you all so much for watching. Special Patreon shout out to A. Vox, Aaron Kwolek, Blackfoot Ferret, Chris Shelton, Christopher Oliva, Doug Prince, DX Buster, David Molnar, Elijah, GM Pinks, Hey Quiggles, Jay Roos, Jacoby Fitzpatrick, Kevin Zanowski, Karen Arter, Nami Babs, Nick Irving, and Ryan Talbert. Thank you so much for your generous support. You heard it here, Sonic, I'm doing it. It's almost done. I was thinking about maybe doing Frontiers, but then it ended up being okay enough, so I'm like, okay, well, I'm gonna do the bigger project that I thought would be more interesting. And like I said, Gotham Knights, but we're gonna have a lot of videos for the rest of the year, so strap in before I take my eternal slumber. By that, I mean like a nap in January. You know how it is. I love you all, thank you so much for watching, and hey, brush your tongue, do it, your breath smells.